Hey everybody, welcome back to the Convo Couch. I'm Fiorella Isabel, and I am here with the Pasadena Mayor Terry Tornek. Mayor, thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
So, Mayor, I wanted to discuss a couple of questions that a lot of the people of the city have been bringing up to us, specifically regarding the recent actions regarding Anthony McClain's vigil. So, let's start off with that. Why did you feel the need to disassemble the Anthony McClain Vigil?
The city manager and the city police chief acted to dismantle the vigil because the practice in Pasadena has been when we have one of these vigils, these street memorials that typically they're up for 2 weeks or less and then they're cleared away. In this instance, there was a particular problem, it seems, because it had become a location for a variety of criminal activities, not the people that were maintaining the vigil, but people that were using the site as a location. It became sort of a hotspot, and some of the neighbors were complaining that they were fearful, particularly after we had a double shooting up there last week. They were concerned that there was too much activity happening in that neighborhood, and they were afraid that they had lost the peace and quiet that they'd expect in a residential neighborhood.
Can you specify what kind of criminal activity that was?
Yeah, the calls for service were increasing for things like drinking in the street, dice games, general loitering, and fighting, and most importantly, that double shooting.
Okay, and there was a video that went viral on Twitter where you and your wife were seen kicking these flowers and pushing that aside. Why did you feel the need to take those actions, and do you regret that those actions now?
Well, the event that happened at my house last Friday was nominally about a vigil for Anthony McClain, but it really sort of devolved into a sort of a political rally um, where there was support for my opponent in running for this reelection next Tuesday.
Hmm.
But more than that, it was about dismissing criminal charges against that are pending against the organizer of the rally, rather than about Mr. McClain. And the material that was left in front of my house, there were candles, vigil candles, votives that we moved from the street onto the curb because we didn't want, it's a narrow street and we didn't want cars to run into them. There was some signage that was inflammatory and incendiary about the police department that I didn't want to have in front of my house. And the flower thing was simply my wife not wanting to handle material, not touch material, but wanting to move everything to the curb from out of the street. It was not intended as being disrespectful. We left the votive candles there until yesterday when they burned out. But really, this idea of sort of using the tragedy surrounding the shooting of the loss of life and the shooting of a person in the street to sort of move forward other political issues, I think is inappropriate and not the right thing to do.
Yeah, great. So what political issues are you referring to? Are you referring to the defunding the police calls, or are you referring to the election and your opponent, Gordo?
No, really the interesting thing is that I've been working hard to move forward the issues of related to police reform and police oversight, uh, gaining more community acceptance for the and trust for the police department, and having the police department have a better relationship ongoing with the community. That's something that there's, I think, widespread agreement on, and we've been making good progress with that. By city standards, we've been moving ahead at sort of lightning speed in terms of moving toward that. So the issues really relate to the local election, relate to the aspirations of particular individuals in the city about gaining a spokesperson role. And I think, so for example, the other day, the police department had a scheduled activity, sort of a community outreach activity up at Starbucks at Fair Oaks and Orange Grove. where they were attempting to sort of meet the department and encourage interaction between the department and people in the neighborhood. And some demonstrators showed up at that, disrupted that activity, prevented it from going forward, because they started cursing at the police and saying nasty things about them, and disrupted those that were trying to attend that community-based activity. I don't think that moves forward the relationship between the department and the people in the neighborhood.
Okay, so if their protests aren't moving forward, what are you doing to bring justice to what happened with Anthony McClain? And of course, Pasadena is one municipality. We are seeing the tensions between police and protesters in the community really amped up.
Well, the major thing that we're trying to do with regard to the lessons learned from Anthony McClain, and that's not the first police shooting we've had in Pasadena, unfortunately, is to try to make sure that we're doing everything we can to prevent that kind of activity. And that's what the long-term issue is, making sure that we hire the right people, that they're trained properly, that they've got the right attitude and mindset about what their job really is, the non-warrior mentality, using other kinds of response teams rather than just uniformed armed police to certain kinds of calls. We've been doing that, for quite some time. We have what we call the HOPE team, which responds to mental health calls and some homeless calls that the department gets, which are specially trained officers working in conjunction with a social worker, not just regular beat cops, so that we can avoid confrontations like that and try to minimize any conflict. But there's a long way to go, and it's my feeling that if we can establish a more trusting relationship between the department and the community, everybody comes out ahead. There's less likely to be violent confrontations, and the police will actually be safer as well in doing their job. In terms of the defunding issue, I mean, we've been examining our budget in terms of how we spend our dollars. And although clearly the police department has been which is not untypical in cities, the largest department in terms of the amount of their budget, we've been looking at it in the context of how much we spend on housing and how much we spend on recreation programs and job programs. We've been re-examining our budget for some time in terms of making sure that we have the right allocation of dollars in terms of how we spend our money in the city.
Do you believe that the police are being held accountable for their actions here in Pasadena?
I think that they are. I think that part of what needs to be recognized is that there are a series of state laws and court findings that kind of frustrate everybody's desire to be more transparent and to be more clear on how people are held accountable. The transparency part is a continuing challenge. We've done our best in terms of trying to release police videos as quickly as we can, the body cam videos and the dash cam videos, so that people can see it. But then the way they're released became the subject of, so the speed wasn't the issue this time. This time it had to do with the editing and the fact that not everything was released at once. I mean, so we still have some lessons to learn there. But I think that there has been a real effort on the part of the city and the department to be more transparent. In terms of the accountability issue, I mean, as far as some people in the community are concerned, if an officer is involved in a shooting, even peripherally, but certainly directly, that they should be fired immediately or relieved of duty. In reality, there's a process, and it's a lengthy and a cumbersome and sometimes too opaque process in making sure that we understand who really did what and whether they did it within policy or outside of policy. And it doesn't satisfy people in the community. I mean, they just know there's somebody dead and there's an officer that did it and they shouldn't be on the job anymore. It's not as obvious as that. And the officers have certain rights as well. And in reality, if you want to maintain a police force, that will be effective and protect the public from the bad people who are out there who are committing crimes, you can't create a situation where they're afraid to do their job under any circumstance, because if they act as opposed to ignoring what's happening, they run the risk of being fired and not able to complete their job. So there's a balancing act here that people are not sensitive to or willing to accept, but those of us in positions of responsibility need to acknowledge.
Um, what have you done as do you believe that if the protesters have if they're protesting because they don't feel like things are being taken into account, what else could they do besides protest then if they feel like the police aren't being held accountable and they feel like there is kind of oversight, there's not enough oversight into what's happening? What other things could they do besides protests?
Well, there are some pretty well organized and effective groups, longstanding groups in the city that don't just appear, when there's a crisis event, but are working long term to change the landscape and make an impact on the way city government functions. We have a number of them in Pasadena. Some of them have been, like the NAACP, have been around for 100 years. We have others like POP and CCOP, that are local organizations that have been around, for a lesser time than that, but have still been very effective in terms of breaking down the issues and making sure that the city council, the elected officials, and the police department are held accountable. And it's not just a hit and run activity. They are really in it for the long haul. They attend the meetings, they make great presentations, they make thoughtful presentations, and they engage on a sustained basis. People who are frustrated want to see immediate action. I understand that. I'm not dismissive of that. I'm sympathetic to it. I have granddaughters that have reminded me all the time about how important it is to be responsive and not just, tell people that they've got to wait if they want to achieve real reform. But I think, in the specific answer to your question is, there are organizations and like-minded people that are deeply engaged in this process and who really will make a difference in terms of how it functions in the future.
Do you specifically take money from police unions?
No, I never have.
You never have. Okay. And what is
but
your...
Let me explain. Let me expand on that.
Okay.
I haven't, and some of my colleagues, most of my colleagues do. I haven't, because I don't take money from any municipal union. I don't take it from the firefighters, who are much less controversial, but actually contribute a lot more to political campaigns than the police do. Because I don't think that people who vote on the salaries of municipal employees should be, there's a sort of an inherent conflict, the appearance of a conflict of interest. So it's not so much because, frankly, that I object to taking money from cops. I just don't think that city officials should be taking money from unions that you're negotiating with on their compensation.
So you mentioned defunding the police earlier, but what's your opinion on that? And if not that, then what other reform would you be willing to commit to?
Well, I think defunding is sort of an unfortunate choice of description. I think what it evolved to, in most of the literature that I've looked at, is sort of reimagining. There's two different pieces. One is, how does the police department itself work? And this issue about, if you have a mental health call, a 911 call that's about a mental health issue or about a homeless person, do cops with guns need to respond to that? Should that be the automatic response? I think the answer to that is no. And as I said, we've already been, we've been doing that for a couple of years with our HOPE teams. Now the fire department has one of those teams called the PORT team. So we're along the road of trying to evolve in terms of how we respond to that. So that's the police operations part. The second part is how we spend our money as a society. And the issue is, are we spending more on law enforcement and not enough on the things that might ultimately result in a lesser need for law enforcement? If we spent it on youth programs, if we spent it on improving our public education system, in the long term, wouldn't that really create a society where we had less need to do police enforcement? And I think that's true. And I've been a big advocate of those programs for a long time. I'm the one that came up with the idea to tax ourselves with increased sales tax 2 years ago, to provide additional funding, local funding, to the school district, because they don't have enough money to do the job they need to do with our kids. And so I acknowledge that. And I think that we need to spend more money on housing and on youth programs and on employment programs, all this stuff that really builds a more positive society. That's the defunding part of it. It's really not defunding so much as just reallocation of money, and words do make a difference. But police, law enforcement and the police function will always be one of the fundamental components of city government. I think we have a good police department. I don't think it's a perfect department, but I think it's a good one. And I think for the most part, they've been working hard and training hard to avoid the kinds of tragedies we had with Anthony McClain. But when we do have them, we have to make sure that they're investigated properly, and as you've said, that people are held accountable.
So you mentioned the protesting, and that there are other ways besides protesting, but what is your stance on the First Amendment right regarding the protests, because it is the First Amendment right, and also the media covering these protests, meaning what are the limitations of these groups?
Well, I think we're very respectful of First Amendment rights. We haven't had the kind of confrontations that have happened in a lot of other cities, fortunately. I mean, our police, for the most part, attempt to take a very non-confrontational position with regard to protests. We cherish the rights of First Amendment rights. And I think, I've been to a couple of the demonstrations at City Hall. They were well attended. They were respectful. They were frank and outspoken, but they weren't violent, and they weren't destructive. I think where we start to go sideways on these demonstrations is when people start threatening other people and destroying property, and then the police have to sort of behave in a different way. But I think in Pasadena, frankly, both the protesters and the police have behaved in a very respectful way, and I think it's beneficial.
And just, this is a little bit off topic, but it kind of relates. Homelessness is getting worse everywhere in Los Angeles now. There are increasing interactions between the unhoused and law enforcement. What are you doing to mitigate this situation that's plaguing all of LA County, particularly in Pasadena? Because that could also lead to potential more violence or more tensions between the people that are already out there and law enforcement.
Well, in fact, in Pasadena, the homeless population has declined by 20% over the last 2 years. And that's because we have very active programs to house homeless people. We build housing for homeless people, and we have a variety of other creative ways, I think, to try and get people off the street. But in reality, we still have, so we've been fortunate in not having the explosion of the homeless population that's happened in a lot of cities in Los Angeles County. But we still have more than 300 people every night sleeping on the street in Pasadena, and that's not acceptable. The city continues to invest in a program. We just invested $2 million in a program with the Salvation Army on the corner of Walnut and Catalina and Mentor to build another 65 or 68 units of housing for homeless people. So it's a tangible indication of what we do. And this past week we approved 112, I think, units on a vacant lot that the city owns across from City Hall to build housing for homeless people. So Pasadena is working hard to reduce the homeless population. When in terms of interaction with the homeless, though, you're absolutely right. I mean, there is always the danger of violent confrontation, and that's why we rely on the Hope teams. We have 3 of them. We'd like to have more. We don't have 24/7 coverage with those Hope teams, but we are attempting to do more. And when the libraries were open, we actually because the libraries were a kind of a focus point for homeless activity and during the day, we actually put a social worker, an intake worker at the main branch library to try to bring services to the homeless rather than ignoring them. So I think our record with regard to the homeless, both in terms of trying to provide homes for them and also to avoid confrontation is pretty good.
So the vast majority of economists have predicted that we are still likely to experience more economic fallout from the coronavirus pandemic and the subsequent unemployment. What is your plan when evictions run rampant and people become more unhoused, and also that brings in more protests against the landlords, against the city, against whatever it is?
Yeah, I'm very worried. You're absolutely right. I mean, it doesn't take an economist to recognize that the outfall, the midterm at least, results of the pandemic are going to be awful, and we are going to experience, when the eviction moratoriums run out, when people's benefits are removed, depending on what happens next Tuesday, if healthcare benefits are rolled back, that we could be confronting a very serious situation. I don't have all the answers to that, but what I will say is that we have been working with landlord groups. For the most part, the responsible landlords know that throwing people out is not a great solution for them. We don't have rent control in Pasadena, so there's no incentive to move people out so you can boost the rent on a unit that's currently at a very low rate. There isn't that incentive. And most of the responsible landlords recognize that if they've got a long-term tenant that they have had in the place, that to not work out some deal with them and just throw them out doesn't make any sense, and we wind up with a vacant unit if nobody can afford to move into it. So we continue to work with them. We have a very active housing department. We've been fortunate in being able to get several allocations of federal dollars to try to help people pay their back rent, the rent that they haven't been able to pay due to the pandemic. We're doing what we can, but I will confess that if this all starts to go bad and the pandemic goes on a lot longer than we've endured it already, I don't have any ready solutions for some of the issues that you have described. We'll just continue to plug away and try to be effective with the resources that we have at our disposal.
Jonny, anything else? Okay. All right, Mayor, thank you so much for coming on and answering these questions. Is there anything else you'd like to tell the community regarding the Anthony McClain shooting, regarding the the vigil, anything else that you could say to put them at ease, or to kind of refer to what you are trying to do to really bring justice to what's happened?
Well, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about these issues. This is a tough time. I mean, when you overlay the pandemic and the social justice controversies and all the other stuff that's going on, people are in not in a happy frame of mind. And now the election tension, national election tension. People are not in a happy frame of mind, and it's easy to kind of really react almost violently because everybody's so frustrated and fed up. What I would say is that in spite of the pandemic and all the other stuff that we've been talking about, we are making a real effort. We continue to meet with people in the community, all kinds of people in the community, to try to figure out what we can do, not just around the narrow issue of a vigil for Mr. McClain, although that is a sort of a heart-wrenching and important issue, but the larger issues in terms of the things that community needs and how the city is or is not addressing them. And I think people are stepping up. I mean, people who have not typically been engaged are willing to engage and are engaging. And some of the traditional people who have been in the past very much engaged, but now for some reason or other may have drifted away, are stepping back in. So I'm very optimistic about the outcomes with regard to working on some of these issues and bringing them to a more favorable conclusion in Pasadena than we've seen elsewhere.
And are you willing to meet with these protesters if they so ever want to speak with you regarding these issues?
I've always been willing to meet. I don't think the optimum place is with people yelling at you in front of your house in the dark, but I'm always willing to meet with everybody. I meet with everybody.
Okay, Mayor, thank you very much. And thank you guys for watching. Convo out.